Hi there. I'm so glad to be back. At the same time, addressing issues on the agenda of NPC, National People's Congress, our top legislature. Newly elected Chinese President Xi Jinping on Sunday signed his first presidential decree to appoint Li Keqiang as premier. Young Xiaodu was elected the director of the National Supervisory Commission at the ongoing first session of the 13th National People's Congress. What do these appointments mean for policy and governmental structure? What are the priorities for the Chinese government, and how will the government reshuffle affect China in the coming years? To discuss these issues and more today, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University, Mr. Andy Mark, Managing Director of Red Pagoda Resources, and Mr. Xi Jinping, current affairs commentator with China Radio International. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our show here, gentlemen. With only two naysayers, almost unanimously, Premier Li Keqiang was voted into office, of course, upon the nomination of President Xi Jinping. What do you think of his performance? Why did he get so popular with the constituents here?
I think the biggest reason was that he faithfully executed the agenda of Xi Jinping, is the first point. The second is, over this 5-year period, nothing bad happened. So we look back, there was a lot of concern, and even in the West, some rooting for something bad to happen in China. But especially with the economy, it chugged along at, what, 6.5 to 7% GDP growth rate. So I think that's the biggest, reason why he had such support.
So the balance sheet isn't very bad for the Chinese administration. I mean, the State Council. What are your thoughts about the performance of Premier Li Keqiang?
Well, I think he was chosen again, number one, loyalty. Number two, he is a good voice and face of China to the world, particularly on economic issues. Thirdly, he had some difficult economic issues to deal with over the 5 years, with corporate governance, with stock market, with real estate, and he dealt with it. I mean, not everything went smoothly over the years, but the trend line was up, and I think he was given credit internally for effectively heading off a downturn in the economy.
Does your understatement suggest that Rex Tillerson was fired because he didn't show enough loyalty to the president, or is largely because of the policy disputes?
Well, there it was both. And here, we don't know. I mean, first, we know there's absolute loyalty. Secondly, we don't know if there are policy disputes, because it's not like the United States.
And therefore, our discussion should focus on the issue of how to define loyalty. Maybe criticism, constructive criticism, is the best manifestation of loyalty to your boss. Well, that's really philosophical. But Qinbo, how do you review the performance of Premier Li Keqiang?
Well, in terms of the transformation of Chinese economic growth model, I was very impressed by Premier Li Keqiang's emphasis on this innovation, and also establishing a new business for young people. And that's the right way to go for the Chinese economy. The drivers should be innovation instead of relying heavily on the investment and export anymore.
Who is in the driver's position? Of course, it's General Secretary, General Secretary Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping, Chairman of the Central Military Commission. But if we compare the Chinese government to the board of directors, who is the chairman, who is the president, who is the CEO, who is the CFO? Is that a clumsy comparison, or do you think this is a very clever figurative speech to shed light on how China's economy is run?
Well, I think China is a very unique case in that clearly, from the government perspective, the ultimate power resides with the National People's Congress. But as we see in this new era, the party is taking a much more direct role, and that I think that's one of the important developments of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. That it's not just a change in China, but it's actually unveiling a new model for governance that is radically different from this liberal democracy that we've seen in the West.
And I think in the post-Mao era, I think that the board of directors is a good apt comparison for the governance of China, for the top level of governance, where you've had a CEO, the president, and then you've had a board. I think that the difference that we've seen under President Xi Jinping is it's a very strong CEO, a policy maker, not just someone who is responding to the wishes of the board.
Well, in a sense, it is similar to the so-called like a presidential system, right? You have the president, and the president appointed his own cabinet members, including the premier, and of course, all these members will work faithfully to implement his policies in terms of economic management and other sectors.
What are the functional differences between the State Council and the Central Committee of the CPC? Who executes the policy? Is that the State Council or the Communist Party of China? Because previously, during Deng Xiaoping's years, he deliberately separated the role and the functions of the Communist Party from the execution of policies. He left that job to the State Council. Today, it seems that both have been combined together, with the party being prioritized in terms of the leadership. What do you think of this latest move, the political one?
Well, I think one of the strengths of the Chinese system is its ability to adapt to changing global conditions as well as changing domestic conditions. So in the past, particularly under Deng Xiaoping, the role of the party kind of receded from government and from society to focus more on ideological issues. I think now we're seeing the reemergence of the party for various reasons. I think because of the global environment as well as the current challenges facing China, that there is much more overlap now between the party, the government, academia. I think that was the saying, right, that these are all points on the compass, but the party is in the center. And we're seeing this, I think, as the new reality in this new era.
And it's correct that we have entered into the new era about the Xi Jinping thoughts. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. Rick, as the head of the government, what are the challenges facing Premier Li in facilitating structural transformation of the Chinese economy?
Well, I think the biggest challenges that he faces are inefficient state-run enterprises. He needs to make the state-run enterprises more competitive because it's not just the Chinese market, you're talking about global markets. And the second thing is corruption. Corruption leads to inefficiency. And so if you're talking about those challenges with economic growth, those are the two things. They're both difficult. I mean, they're both very difficult because it takes both political power and will because you're dealing with long-entrenched interests in state-owned enterprises, in military. And this is something that the Prime Minister, the Premier Li Keqiang, is going to have to deal with the full support of President Xi Jinping.
How do you define structural reform of the Chinese economy? Is it because of the apparent shift from export-led growth to domestic spending, or it's something else?
I think it measures at least in two aspects. On the financial sense, of course, the risk prevention is still the priority for the next 5 years. I think China is in need of establishing a system or mechanism that is not too liberal, not too conservative. It's a delicate balance, right? If it's too liberal, and then there tend to be problem, and too conservative, and then there's a tightening credit, and then the economic growth will be affected. And secondly, it's also about still building the fundamentals of the market economy to welcome investment from overseas and to build the better environment for business to grow in China. I think this is critical for the next 5 years.
How do you look at the confidence of both consumers and investors in China at this moment, given the financial risks, the bubbles in the real estate market, as well as tightening control on the outbound flight of capital?
My sense is that from a business perspective or from an investment perspective, whether that's domestic or foreign, I think the outlook is guardedly optimistic, because on the one hand, we see with the change in the Constitution, with the removal of the two-term limit, that for the foreseeable future, that there is political stability. You know, some of the other guests mentioned some of the economic issues, but I think also social stability is a very, very huge issue here, with rising expectations from consumers, especially the middle class. That needs to be properly managed. There's also threats of extremism, terrorism around the world. I think China faces these same threats as well. So I think that there are very identifiable challenges, but I think the attitude is guardedly optimistic, and one of the big, I think, question marks, of course, is how does this U.S.-China dynamic play out, especially in the trade arena?
Despite the growing confidence that characterizes the new generation of the Chinese leadership, some Chinese scholars pointed out that we face two challenges, internally and externally. In terms of domestic politics, middle-income trap would be a very difficult area, and China will be struggling with the Lewis turning point. Externally is the Thucydides trap, meaning inevitable clashes between the rising power and presiding power. Let's look at, first of all, our domestic concerns. China has entered into the middle-income ranking among all other economies the world over. Does it mean that we have entered into the turbulent waters? According to Professor Samuel Huntington, the middle class in the olive-shaped society would appeal more to the sense of justice and the rule of law, and therefore, you know, the procedure justice would first and foremost be the priority on the agenda, and that will seriously undermine the efficiency of policy execution, wreaking havoc with the Chinese mode of development. What do you think of this analysis or discourse?
I think you've raised important points, and I think that the growth in the middle class, which is undeniable, I mean, the growth in China economically over the past 3 decades is unparalleled in world history, but with the positive comes risk. It comes expectations that people have, particularly with Chinese openness to the world and seeing the way things work in other countries. But I also want to add that you have an increasing gap between the very rich, people who have really benefited, and the China billionaire class, and the people who have been left behind. And I think that's one of the government's biggest challenges in the years ahead, is managing everyone's expectations. The poorer people and rural people who have been left behind, to try to keep bringing them up, and middle class who expect continuing improvement in their standard of living and more openness the way they see it, which is not necessarily the way the government sees it.
What do you think of the issue of social stability? Do you think that we have this issue of economic polarization in terms of the income discrepancy, the extremely poor and extremely rich? What's the percentage of these two classes categorically? Because for a middle income society, it seems that we have more social stability than the other way around. I'd like to have your take.
Yes, people, if you look at China purely through the numbers, you would see there's a big problem, like the discrepancy between the rich and poor. You would say, oh, people are rising probably against the government. No, it's not that. Partly because the rise of China is the rise of different classes. Even the poorest people, they are improving in terms of the living standards. So they're not that unhappy with a billionaire lifestyle. So with that being said, I think there are gaps for China to deal with, between rich and poor, between the urban and the rural area, between eastern part rich and the western part lagging behind. I think we need to deal with that in the next 5 years.
And perhaps the crusade against the poverty with no one being left behind,
yes,
that's the vow by President Xi Jinping, will help stabilize or cushion the impact brought about by structural restructuring. Having said this, what do you think of, say, that Chinese saying, 政令不出中南海, 九龙治水, 9 dragons, handling the water crisis. The central government directives won't travel beyond the walls of Zhongnanhai. That's the English version of 政令不出中南海. Today, with the elimination of term limits, we have very serious public debates about what it means for the political future of China. Skeptical Western observers would say, hey, this is something like dictatorship. But if you look at the polls of the Chinese folks, they would say not very bad, because we need to have concentration of powers to ensure, as you said, predictability and transparency of the policy execution. Now, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness of policy execution in China, I'm not talking about westernization in other developing countries. So what do you think of the new realities?
Well, I think this is a fascinating question, because China historically has been an authoritarian hierarchical system of governance. And the track record of this system, thousands of years, arguably is much more successful than this relatively modern innovation of a liberal democracy. So in this sense, I think that that there is this reclaiming, perhaps, of this term authoritarian, quote-unquote authoritarian, that we're seeing a strengthening at the center with Xi Jinping at the core. And this removal of the term limits, I think why that's important is, again, if we use a corporate comparison, whenever a new CEO comes, there's a new philosophy, a new way of doing things. And a lot of times the old-timers know that they just put their heads down, wait it out, because the CEO will go after a few years. And I think that this now makes it less likely, or it's harder now to avoid getting on board the Xi Jinping train, as it were.
The White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon have all pinpointed China as a potentially strategic competitor, if not a threat, geopolitically and economically. Where does that argument come from? Is it because they seriously disagree with internal politics and the way China is run by Chinese politicians, the Communist Party of China, or is it just purely geopolitical rivalry?
I think you have to divide it into two. One is economic, and this is one where I think economic competition is good. I think is it
good? President Trump says,
well,
I have to put America first.
I'm not drawing a value judgment about Donald Trump, but the idea of fighting over innovation, of serving underserved countries, Africa, South Asia, that's good in theory. Now the other is geopolitical, as you said, and that I think is inevitable. I mean, you mentioned Thucydides' trap, whether we talk about that or you just talk in general. China is a rising power globally. China over the past 5 years has become more involved in global issues, from the United Nations to global economic governance, and that's something that by definition will threaten the United States, which has been the lone superpower in the world since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think inevitably there's going to be some tension there, and that, unlike economic competition, which I think is good, that leads to potential military or diplomatic strains.
President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang have got many congratulatory messages from world leaders the world over. Most of them were pouring praises on the resolute leadership of President Xi Jinping. It means this is a highly centralized power, something that the West feels uncomfortable with. And therefore, do you think we're going to have more conflicts and skirmishes between China and the West?
Well, first I will say Donald Trump is not uncomfortable with it. He joked about that. He said, well, maybe I can be president for life now. Maybe that's a good idea. But yes, I think the West is uncomfortable with the idea of unlimited terms. I think you look in history, in recent history, of people who served 30, 40 years until death or until they were overthrown. And I think that the West views that as not the best way to go. And as people serve for longer and longer, there tends to be more corruption within. Now in China, you're talking about a president who says, I'm here to fight corruption. But historically, if you look on the other side, whether it is a Stalin or a Mugabe, you end up with more and more corruption as time goes by.
A European politician said famously, absolute power corrupts absolutely, hence the establishment of the National Supervisory Commission. Members of not only the National Military Commission, but also Premier Li Keqiang, director of the newly established National Supervisory Commission, all pledged allegiance to the Constitution, saying we will do whatever we can to respect the constitutional spirit, to help the people, serve the people. Now, having said this, what do you think of the issue of accountability in China, Jinbo?
Accountability obviously is increasingly, I would say, awareness on the Chinese officialdom. Let's say, basically officials at different levels. You would see over the past 5 years, anti-corruption mostly targeting at party officials, but then there's officials who are not party affiliated, and that's why part of the reason we have this National Supervisory Commission here to combine the role basically of the CCTN of the party and also that of the supervisory ministry and the procuratorate here.
The integrity of the ruling party is indeed so important to have a clean house, clean government, clean party above all. Therefore, do you compare our National Supervisory Commission to the Hong Kong equivalent of ICAC, which is only under the SAR executive and above all other in the society of Hong Kong?
I do think that's an interesting model because if we look, obviously Hong Kong is so much smaller than China, but it faced similar problems with corruption from the street level to the highest levels of government. And it was with the introduction of the ICAC that really, I think, scared a lot of people. And it was also not just the fact that you could be caught, but the optics that this was considered unacceptable really, I think, made Hong Kong such a great place to do business for so many years. So I think that is a great parallel.
There's a cynical voice of saying, hey, the National Supervisory Commission is a super body, super ministry, and therefore it enjoys a lot of privileges. Who will supervise the National Supervisory Commission? That's the next question. The American perspective, Rick?
The American perspective would be one person supervises it, the President, General Secretary Xi Jinping. Now, it is by definition extra-legal. It is separate from and actually has precedence over the legal system. And now that you will have this supervisory commission that not only is in charge of discipline for Communist Party members, but can go beyond. And so I think the only way to check that is you have to have either the president or the ruling body making sure that there are no abuses. It becomes difficult when you have that because this body has real power.
Yeah. May I jump in? There's a difference between the Western practice. In theory, politicians in the West or political scientists in the West, they believe this checks and balances. They believe in competition between different ministries, different bodies. But here in China, of course, on the surface, you don't see backs and challenges over here. But in reality, it is elements of checks and balances. For example, the CCTN of the party.
No, you have a different interest groups. So they check and balance each other, right?
Yes, I mean.
We don't have institutionalized checks and balances, but we do have very powerful interest groups whose job is to make sure, oh, you won't surpass me, you won't outperform me, you won't outsmart me, okay?
Right.
So that's a kind of competition.
You're right, and also, a part of the success is due to the tips they receive from the public, actually, about the misbehavior of officials. So that's a part of the supervision, you see. And also, if you say, oh, the super body cannot somehow discipline itself, what about the achievement over the past 5 years of anti-corruption? That's the Communist Party. It's basically cleaning its own body. And that's a success.
And to use another model for this, I mean, we look at, in the U.S. we had the systems of checks and balances in the government. When we look at the military, it's actually a similar structure to the party. There's the IG, the Inspector General's office, right? And there is no multi-party system within the military, but that also, there are abuses there as well, but it seems to work fairly well in terms of rooting out misbehavior, whether that's corruption or other kinds of malfeasance.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm afraid you cannot politicize the command and control structure of the military, because what they do is a reflection of the professional spirit. It's a matter of professionalism within the armed forces. Now, 10 or 20 years from now, gentlemen, we're going to have a new generation of leadership. Most of them are very well educated in the West. Does it mean that they will be brainwashed by Western notions such as the independence of the media and checks and balances by opposition parties in the parliament? We don't have independence of the media or independence of the judiciary. We have, in Chinese, 党要管党, using the inter-party democracy, inter-party oversight, instead of having the external democratic oversight.
Yes.
Although CPPCC is expected to play that role. Kind of. Qinduo, you know more about Chinese politics. Do you think we'll work a different way?
It might evolve. It might have more elements of the Western political practice, but I don't think a copy of Western models is the right way for the Chinese, simply because we have different culture, we have different tradition. If you want to change that from the root, that's just a mission impossible. That will create probably chaos instead of an orderly society.
Do you think in the foreseeable future, gentlemen, we can have a very serious debate between those returned scholars and those homegrown elites? 海归的土鳖, you know. Walter Lippmann, a columnist in the 1950s, said it is those returned scholars or returned Chinese from the West who will change China. In fact, the Premier Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping studied in France. They changed China to a large degree. And we're going to have more debates. One important think tank in Beijing, the head of which says, I will never ever employ any returned scholars because they have been brainwashed by the West. Now, that shocked me. I mean, his allegation did shock me. Do you think that will be a very tough debate?
Well, I think it could go both ways, because I know some returned scholars that are even more committed to the Chinese system, as they could see firsthand some of the shortcomings of the Western system. And domestic scholars, I think, sometimes have this tendency to romanticize the West and think that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, to use an American idiom, that they don't see some of the flaws. I mean, the U.S. has some very strong features to its system, of course, but it also has its flaws.
Almost 40 years of engagement with China led to the widespread belief in the United States that China would be one of us. Obviously, they have been left disillusioned since the 18th National Congress of the CPC. Now, what do you think the future might hold for China, since we're going to have more brilliant students coming back from the United States? Do you think they will be educated the Western way, therefore they would love American way of thinking, lifestyle values? There's the different voice at the same time. Forgive me for giving a long statement about this prospect. The younger generation, born in the new millennium, they never went through the Cultural Revolution or the leftist ideology that wreaked havoc with our economy during the Cold War. They love their country so deeply, so values of humanity may not beat their zealous patriotism. And therefore, when they come under heavy geopolitical pressure from the United States, they'll be driven to love China, their motherland, even more deeply. Hence, you're going to have more clashes.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me look at two things. One is, a lot of the American analysis of China over the past 20 years has turned out to be wrong. I mean, people either tend to be, China will be a huge threat, China as enemy, or the Chinese economy will implode. And there's just been a lot of bad analysis over time, and the predictions almost always are wrong. But as far as Chinese students, as far as the cross-cultural communication, I think it's a good thing. I think not only studying in the United States, studying all around the world, and having access to the way other people think. I think if you are going to be, you as in China, are going to be more involved in world affairs, from economics to diplomacy, you really have to understand how people think. And a lot of the mistakes that I say that American analysts have made is because they don't fully understand China. And so I think this is good. I think, yes, there will be some backlash from the Chinese scholars who say we'll never hire anyone who has studied abroad. But I think that it's a net plus. And I think the students who are coming back are as patriotic as students who don't go abroad. They just have different perspective on the world.
Well, obviously, what Rick says, if you want to get further integrated with the rest of the world, you cannot be just too Chinese. You have to be one of us. At least you have to bear more resemblance for the international society. This is a very broad, loaded discussion about what the future might hold for China, since we're going to have more returned scholars who are educated in the West. we'll have more tough debates. I can foresee that easily. I promise to bring you guys back to the program and discuss what can happen. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for being with us. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time for Voices and Votes. Until then, goodbye.